All right, we are back in the book of Hebrews this morning. Hebrews chapter 11. Somewhere in the book of Hebrews, there's a dad joke about coffee. I actually don't know it, so you have to ask one of my kids. I'm sure they do. I probably knew it once upon a time and told them. They're all looking at me like I have just insulted their mother. So maybe they don't know it. I don't know. Oh, I thought it was like a God joke. All right, anyway. So before we dive in this morning, let us back up and rehearse our memory verse for the month of July. It is not Hebrews 11:1. That memory verse was from when? June, right. The month that immediately precedes July is called June. At least in our calendar. So Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6 is our memory verse for the month of July. So would you read this out loud with me? But without faith, it is impossible to please him, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. And the other thing I want to just kind of by way of review do is our definition of faith. Hopefully by the end of this series, by the end of the summer, you will know the memory verses that we have gone over. They're very important, very significant verses to have a good working knowledge of, and a good working definition of faith. It's like grace and mercy, some of those words that we throw around in Christendom, but we don't always take the moment to define. Faith is simply what? Believing God. That's our working definition. That is, I think, a good definition. Faith is believing God. That has so much you could do with it, but as long as you grasp that, we are good. Well, our tour this morning takes us, in Hebrews chapter 11, our tour through the Faith Hall of Fame takes us to the first of only two women that are in the Faith Hall of Fame. You say, wow, two women. God was really going out there to find two whole women, and when you look at them in a little more detail, you'd be like, maybe you could have left those two out. Today, I think you need the next one further down the line. You get to her, and you're like, really? That was the best woman you could find for the job. Actually, she was. The fact that there are women included in the Faith Hall of Fame actually tells you a lot more than first blush kind of would make evident. You live in the ancient Near East, the first century, where and when this was being written. You're living and working in very kind of patriarchal days. There were very cultures in this time period where women were very much seen as just negligibly above slaves. You could buy them and sell them just like you could slaves. So. And that was true of Roman culture. It was actually true of Jewish culture. Jesus came onto the scene and into the picture and actually elevated the role of women. People say, Christianity has a debasing effect on women. Actually, historically, it has the exact opposite effect. Jesus was one of very few rabbis in his own day that would allow women to hear him teach. And would actually give women a relatively prominent role within his inner circle, befriending them, teaching them, taking them along with him. And so the gospel has always had that kind of impact, that kind of effect. And so the fact that there's any women in here at all is actually really raises the bar pretty high. So we run in the first woman that we're going to run across is a woman by the name of Sarah. Now, you may have heard of her before. Certainly, if you have read the early part of Genesis, you've heard of her. She was the wife of Abraham, but she is here in this moment, in this entry, if you will, into the Faith Hall of Fame, on her own accord. And how many of you, let me just stop. Can I pause for a moment and just ask you a question? I'm going to stop preaching. I'm just going to ask you a question here. How many of you have gone back through and read, say, Genesis 12 through, I don't know, maybe the end of Genesis. It's like 38 chapters or so. Recently. Anybody gone through there recently? I'm going to say encourage you to do that, because Bible reading is a good thing. Seeing all of these characters in their context is a good thing. Let me encourage you to do something else, though. We tend to read our Bible with rose-colored glasses on, as though the people about whom we're reading were somehow super normal, super natural, super different from us. That's actually not the case. We're told in the New Testament that the people that are in the Old Testament, the people their stories are told in the Bible, were people just like us. They had the same passions, they had the same drives, the same ideas, the same shortcomings. And in some cases, what you'll find in the book of Genesis, it's almost uncomfortable to tell you this, is that you will find that some of these characters actually had more shortcomings than you do. So read with a sense of God's grace, to think, wow, it is absolutely amazing what God could do with some really messed up people. And sometimes I feel better about myself when I read about their lives, and that's saying something. And I'm like, wow, if God could do all that with them, then maybe he could actually do something with me, because I don't feel as messed up when I read that. So let me encourage you to say, wow, that's quite a shining endorsement there of the book of Genesis, Pastor. It is. It's a shining endorsement of God's grace. But give it a read. It's a good thing. So Hebrews chapter 11, we find Sarah's entry here in the Faith Hall of Fame, and then we'll back it up and we'll look at her story in the book of Genesis. But Hebrews chapter 11, beginning in verse 11. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. And so Sarah is here because she had the faith, she believed God enough to receive something. Now, there is a strange thing that happens when we read verses in isolation. If we were to read them in isolation and we just see this, it straight up says that Sarah had the faith to receive a promise from God. Did you get that as we read through those verses? That Sarah had the faith. Sarah believed God and she received something from God. Now, to say that there is more to the story than that would be a huge understatement, because there is a lot more to the story than just that. Keeping in mind, that is the ultimate summation. Sarah believed God, and she received from God. There was a lot more to that. So let me invite your attention back to the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 18. Genesis chapter 18, and we're going to pick up in verse 9. Now, to kind of set the stage here in Genesis chapter 18, the immediate surrounding context is that God had come down to earth in the flesh with a pair of angels to do a little bit of investigation, a little bit of reconnoitering, if you will, in the city of Sodom. Now, who's here coming to investigate the city of Sodom? If we say God in the flesh had come to investigate the city of Sodom, who are we talking about? Jesus, because Jesus is God in the flesh. You say, where is Jesus in the Old Testament? Here you go. Genesis chapter 18, we find a time where he comes down with two angels. He, on his way to Sodom, stops by Abraham's tent. I almost called it a house, but it was a tent. Stopped by Abraham's place, and Abraham went out of his way to try to be a good host. he had some sense at the outset of this encounter that he was dealing not with terrestrial beings. Not that they were aliens, though I guess you could call an angel alien because they are not normal for us. But he understood that he was dealing with God's representatives. And so he immediately begins preparations to feed them. It's interesting, you read, he's like, hey, let me go get you a bite to eat. Now, they had to, you've been in a restaurant, you're like, did they have to go kill the cow? He actually did. We're told that, had to go kill the cow. So you can imagine, this is a little bit, lengthy. This is more than a, mid-afternoon snack. This took an hour, 2 hours to put it together. But he did that, and so he has this, and then he has this conversation, and as the conversation wears on, he understands that he's dealing with God in the flesh. But in Genesis chapter 18, we find Sarah's story, and Sarah's story begins simply with a promise. It begins with a promise. Look in Genesis chapter 18 and verse 9. Then they said to him, where is Sarah, your wife? So he said, here, in the tent. Now, Abraham had moved them from the tent out to the shade of a tree because it was warm out. You can imagine the Middle East and how that must be in midday. And so Abraham himself was sitting, when they showed up, he had been sitting in the doorway of the tent, where it was still shaded but not inside because, large covered areas, even though they're in the dark, tend to get a little bit warm under the sun. And so Abraham had moved them out under a shade tree, and he's like, she's there in the tent. And so, if you can imagine him kind of pointing over his shoulder, that's basically what he just did, that she was there in the tent. Look at the promise then in verse 10. And he, is that capitalized in your Bible? The he there? Because this is he, Jesus, he, God, in the flesh. And he said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life, and behold, Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. And so there is the promise that God gave to Sarah, that she was going to have a son. Now, we've kind of skipped around, and this is why reading it is a good idea for you. If we were to jump around in context to try to figure out some ages here, here's what we would find. We would find that Abraham is 100 years old. Somewhere, approaching 100, just after 100, somewhere in that area. 99 or 100, right in that area. Sarah is 10 years younger than him. That makes her how old? 89 or 90, right? If you did the math right. I know we're in church and mathing is not your thing. But and so Abraham's about 100 years old. Sarah's about 90 years old. And so Jesus just comes up and says, Sarah, I'm going to restore you to childbearing age, and you are going to have a son. Now, this poses a problem for Sarah. If you look in verse 11, we get some commentary. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old. How old? 190 respectively, right? Well advanced in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Now, this particular verse, this particular phrase, actually seems to be straightforward. Any of you doubt what that means? It's kind of obvious, right, on the surface. There are people who object to this. And so let me just throw this out there. Here's the basis of their objection. And this is something that we covered last week. And so you remember last week we talked about how old Abraham was and how old Terah was and all of these things. We went through all of that mathing. It was like biblical algebra here for a minute there. If you've forgotten, go back to our Facebook page, our YouTube page, find last week's message. Go ahead and re-watch or listen to that. But how old was Terah, Abraham's father, when he began having children? 70. How old was Terah when Abraham was born? Okay, old, right? Older than Abraham is now in this narrative, in this story? Yeah, by a solid 3 decades or better. And so the objection is, well, Abraham was born when his father was older than he is now. And so Abraham should have been able to have children. Add to that, if you were to keep reading here in the book of Genesis, eventually you're going to find that Sarah is going to die before Abraham does. Abraham's going to remarry, and guess what Abraham has after he remarries? A whole litter of kids. Like, many. So, should Abraham have been able to have children? Yeah, should have been able to, and so the fact that he's old maybe doesn't really matter for a lot. How about Sarah? Should Sarah have been able to have children? Well, we don't know. Sarah was clearly barren up until this point in her life. And we're clearly told in Hebrews, in Genesis, other places that we find it, that she was past the age of childbearing. You see, while Terah may have been 130 years old when Abraham was born, we're not told how old Mrs. Terah was, or which Mrs. Terah had Abraham with. We do know that Terah had more than one wife. You say, how do you know that? Because Abraham and Sarah, his wife, were half brother and sister. If you keep reading here in this text, you get to Abraham and Abimelech and some kind of disgraceful stuff in Genesis 19. And Abraham tells Abimelech that she is my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. You see, Terah had several wives. I'm going to go with they were probably younger than him. So, should Sarah have been able to bear children at 90 years old? I would say no. Regardless of whether she had been barren in her younger days or not, it is made clear in this particular text that at her age, she was past childbearing age. Women, aren't you glad that comes to an end at some point? It is a mercy from God that, ladies, you can stop. Yeah, you look at some of those women in the Old Testament, and they start having broods of 20 and 30 kids, and you're like mind-bending, right? So she was past that age. But God had made her a promise, and that promise posed a problem. Because she knew that just wasn't happening no more. Which set her then into a predicament. And we find it here in Genesis 18, beginning in verse 12, the predicament that Sarah had. Therefore, Sarah laughed. We'll come back to that. Therefore, Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord, being old also? And the Lord said to Abraham, now where's Sarah? Spatial reference, where's Sarah? In the tent. Where's Abraham and Jesus? They're outside the tent. They're under some shade trees away. Can you set up a tent directly under a tree? Not readily. So you've got a little bit of distance. She's in the tent. They're over here. Can you see Sarah from where she is? No. Guarantee you, if she's listening, she is invisible on purpose. Right? Ladies, help me out here, be honest. Yeah. She doesn't tell you she's listening, but she's listening. And so, verse 13, the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I surely bear a child since I am old? Then the Lord asks an interesting question. If you have a pen, you should underline this question. If you have a highlighter, you should highlight it. I even highlighted it on the slide. It's that important. Is anything too hard for the Lord? It's a rhetorical question. Don't seek to answer it. The obvious answer is no. But it's an important thing to remember. Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. The thing was determined. Now, Sarah laughed. Is that a big deal? We do try to make mountains out of molehills, don't we? Because there are some who would say, Sarah laughed. See, it's a laugh of disbelief. Anybody agree with that statement? Sarah's laugh was a laugh of disbelief? My hand is already in the air because, yeah, I'm there. Maybe there was some joy there, I don't know, some celebration, but it was like, ha ha, that's good, Jesus, you tell another one. Now, how did Abraham react when he heard the news? Don't read this text here because this is not the first time that Abraham has heard the news. To see that, we actually have to step back a little bit. So, again, if you just read this chapter, you think, look at Abraham was a man of faith. Look at how he reacted. He just took it like God said it and he believed it. Yeah, let's go back to chapter 17 to where Abraham heard this news for the first time himself. Genesis chapter 17, just back a page, probably in your Bibles, and look what he said in verse 15. Then God said to Abraham, as for Sarah your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name, and I will bless her, and also give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples shall be from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed. I mean, he didn't even just laugh. He fell on the ground laughing so hard. Oh, God, that's good. Tell another one. Now, here's what people do. Because Abraham was such a man of faith, and Sarah apparently wasn't. It's true, she wasn't a man of faith. She wasn't a man. People will try to tell you this. See, Abraham believed God, and this was a laugh of joy from Abraham that God was going to give him a son from Sarah. But Sarah's laugh was a laugh of disbelief and mockery. Really? Why? First of all, what prompts us to say this? Machismo? I don't know. Male stupidity? I don't know. Because here's what I can tell you. In the Hebrew, the word laugh is translated both places from the exact same Hebrew word. So if Abraham's laugh was a laugh of joy, and that's how you're going to interpret it, then Sarah's laugh was a laugh of joy. It's the same word. It's a chapter later. You have to use it the same way. Frankly, actually, the Hebrew word that's translated laugh doesn't dictate why you're laughing, just that you're laughing. It's used of laughs of mockery, and it's used for laughs of joy. Same word. Just like if we were saying, I'm laughing at you because you're an idiot, or I'm laughing at you because you're funny, it's the same English word, right? Laugh. Tells what you're doing, not why. In one case, I'm laughing because I'm cruel. In the other thing, I'm laughing because you're funny. I guess it could be the same. But anyway. So what is the basis for saying Abraham's response was one of faith and Sarah's was one of disbelief? Is there any basis? Grammatically, contextually, the answer is no. There is no basis for that. And so if you read somebody who tries to say Abraham responded in faith, yeah, he did in chapter 18 because he'd had time for this idea to sit a while. He'd already had my fall down and laugh on the ground moment. This was the first Sarah had heard of it, and she was having hers. You see, the predicament is they both, at least initially, responded in disbelief. It's not that God was telling a joke. It's just that it was so beyond the pale that they did not believe. Abraham's response was the same as Sarah's in this situation. Now, if we were to continue reading back to Sarah's narrative here, her story, from Genesis 18, and we jump over to Genesis 21, because 19 and 20 don't have a lot to do with this particular story, but if you get to Genesis 21, what you find in verse 1 is that the Lord visits Sarah, as he said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken, for Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the set time which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah had borne to him. That's offset just to make sure you got who her mother was. Named him Isaac. What does Isaac's name mean? It means laughter. They named him Laughter. Because God had turned their laughs of disbelief into laughs of joy. Did Sarah ever start believing God's promise? The answer is unequivocally yes. You say, Pastor, how do you know that? Because she did something. She took action that actually procured the promise of God. Now, I will leave it to your imagination what action she took. But if you read between the lines of the text, there are some things that she wasn't doing that she had to start doing in order to have a baby. You get where I'm going? Parents, you catch my drift? You can explain it to your kids later. She took action. That action led to procuring the promise that God had promised her. Here's a statement, and this is where it all kind of comes together for me. When disbelief turns into belief, belief turns into action, and action turns into reception. Now, some of you are trying frantically to fill in the blanks in your program, and I get that. And if you didn't do that, you should grab a program and get it. I'll say it again. When disbelief turns into belief, belief turns into action, and action turns into reception. Most of the promises that God gives us are not conditional. They are, however, contingent upon us acting when we receive them. They're contingent upon us actually receiving them. That's the action. We have to do something to grab it, to get a hold of it, to unwrap it. The question that Sarah leaves us with is, do we believe God to receive enough to receive his promises and act on them? Do we believe God enough to receive his promises and act on them? That's what Sarah teaches us. She believed God enough to receive, and we know that because she acted. Now, if you haven't heard or figured it out by now, today is a very special day in our house. It's Gideon's birthday. He is 9 today. Where'd he go? Oh, there he is. He's hiding behind his iPad. Okay. Gideon's birthday. Now, let me ask you a question. Just in the the realm of what is normal in life, what do you think the odds are that Gideon is not going to open one of his presents? That he's going to look at the package, he's going to look at the wrapping paper, and he's going to look at it and go, I don't think I'm going to like what's inside that package, and so I'm just not going to open it. Anybody going to go, yeah, I think that's going to happen? You've never seen my kids open presents. They're not, I mean, they tear the wrapping paper after it's off the package even, just to be certain. He's going to receive. He's going to act on the promise of this gift by unwrapping it and by taking possession of it. You see, all of those gifts right now, they're already wrapped. They're sitting in my bedroom waiting for it. Are they his? Not yet. Because they're not his until he unwraps it and takes possession, right? Right now, they're just a promise of happiness to come. It's the same thing with God's promises. They're wrapped, they're ready. All we have to do is just unwrap them and take possession of them. He's given us many tremendous promises. They're the promises of good things to come, but they're not ours until we unwrap them and take possession of them. Here's what I found. There's two basic reasons we don't receive God's promises. Two reasons why we don't. The first is we don't believe. This is where Abraham and Sarah started off. They didn't believe. Sometimes we'll hear a promise that God made and we go, I don't buy that. And so we don't receive it. Not because God is incapable, but because we're incapable of actually receiving it. Happens from time to time. The second reason that we don't receive God's promises is simply ignorance. We don't know what they are. How many things has God promised you personally? Do you know? Can you claim a promise? Can you receive a promise that you don't know anything about? No, not really. Ignorance is the hard one. Actually, it's actually not that hard, because here's what you can do. You can actually find what God's promises are to you. See, he sent this little text message. It's a little bigger than your average text message, but they're all here. You say, I have to read that whole thing? Well, no, you don't have to read that whole thing. So I have this book here. This book is called All the Promises of God. All the promises, of the Bible. All the promises of the Bible. It's written by a guy named Herbert Lockyer. Fantastic book. Actually about the same size. But this book has just the promises that are in the Bible. Pretty handy. Oof, this thing's bigger than I thought. Life Application Study Bible. Anybody have one of those? I have one of those. Thompson Chain Reference Bible. This one's a little beat up. I went through college with this bad boy. They have whole sections on the promises of God. You say, Pastor, books are kind of old school. Fine. Google it. Joshua, show them the results. I don't know if you can see that or not, but at the top of the Google page, it tells you how many responses come back for your thing. I Googled God's promises, and I got back 475 million responses. Can you find out what God's promises are to you? Can you do that? Yeah, look at the top one. God's promises, over 50 encouraging Bible verses and scriptures. Bam! The first thing you're going to find right out of the gate, 50 promises on the same page. And only 474,999,999 pages to go. Can we cure ignorance? I think we can do that, don't you? I can find out, and it's not hard, what God's promises are to me. And so the first thing is just learning what God has promised. There are a lot of things that God has promised to me, a lot of packages that are just sitting, waiting for us to find them and open them and own them. Which brings us back to the disbelief piece of that equation. What happens when you read a promise of God and you say, I don't believe it? That's a whole different issue, isn't it? It really is. When God says, this is so, you say, I don't believe it. When God said, whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved, if you believe that, you act on it. You receive Jesus as your Savior, you enter into relationship with God as your Father, fantastic, everything is well. But if you don't believe it, are you ever going to get there? No, because you're not going to act until you believe. How about this one? We've already taken the offering, so I think I can throw this out there. God said, hey, try me. He said, test me on this one. Give to me what I've asked for you and see if I don't give you more back in return. It's a promise of God. You cannot outgive God. He has guaranteed this. Statistically, most church members do not believe that. And I look at pastor, stuff all the time. Offerings across the church globally are down. The average Christian, we talk about tithing being 10%, and that's a good starting point for what Christians should give. Most Christians statistically give somewhere in the half of 1% range. Not really trusting God on this, are we, collectively? And how do you know we don't believe God? Because we're not acting on what He said. He said, try me. He said, test me. When God says, hey, prove me wrong, I dare you. It's probably a good chance to do that. You want to make money? Give it to God. He's promised to give it back multiplied. Got awfully quiet in here. All I can hear is the buzz in the speakers. And that's just a couple of examples. Train up a child in the way he should go. When he's old, he'll not depart from it. That's a verse we all try to twist instead of claim, because we train up our child to be idiots, and then we complain because they're idiots because God didn't fix them. He didn't promise to fix them. He said, if you do it right, I'll make sure it goes. If you do it wrong, I'll see what I can do. But there are promises all throughout the Bible that God has given to us. They're packages of potential that we just have to unwrap and take possession of. Unwrapping them, finding them, we can do that. Taking possession of them is going to require enough belief to act on whatever God has promised. Sarah is here not because she was a great person, not because she had faith right from the outset. She heard God make an audacious promise, and she laughed in disbelief. But at some point, her disbelief turned into belief, and she acted, and she received the promise of God. And she becomes a demonstration to us that we can do the same thing. We can take the promises of God, even if we don't believe them at first. When we start believing them, start acting upon them, we'll start receiving as well. Sarah had the faith to receive the promise from God. Father, we love you. I thank you for Sarah this morning. We're challenged by the people that we read about here in the Faith Hall of Fame because their lives were in many ways, in some ways, worse than ours. And yet they had moments of incredible faith. And you, being the gracious God that you are, looked at their lives, looked at their weaknesses, knowing who they were, and you simply took those moments of faith and enshrined them to teach us what a life of faith looks like. Father, I'm glad this morning that you understand that in our fallen natures there is a tension between hearing your promise and believing and acting on it. I'm thankful that you don't take our first reaction and walk away with your promise, but you give us the space to kind of internalize it, to accept it, to unwrap it, to look at it, to play with it, before we finally grasp a hold of it and claim it, act on it, and receive it. Father, I thank you for your grace this morning. Would you help us to have the faith enough to receive the promises that you have given to us? Would you help us to act on those promises, understanding that they are packages of potential goodness that just wait for us to grasp a hold of them? Thank you in Jesus' name.